Hello, it's Scott Manley here, still on vacation in Scotland, and up in the space station, Butch and Sunita are still, staying on the space station for an extended vacation. It was supposed to be 8 days, now it's up to 63 days, which means it's actually about to surpass the number of days that the Demo 2 flight with Dragon spent on the space station. That was planned from day one to be that long. Now, yesterday we did have another press conference, an update from the mission managers at NASA, including Ken Bowersox, who, by the way, I casually pointed out that about 20 years ago, Ken Bowersox was actually involved in a space capsule that re-entered and had technical problems which were potentially dangerous to the crew. Him and Don Pettit and, Budarin, I can't remember his first name, they were on the space station when the Columbia disaster happened and they had to return home on the Soyuz, and it was a new type of Soyuz, the TMA-1, and it had a ballistic entry problem which, was not great for them. So anyway, yeah, Ken is obviously speaking from some point of experience when he's expressing concern for the astronauts' well-being. So anyway, yeah, this was a step forward, I think, in the discussion of the situation, because they have finally confirmed that there are actually contingency plans which have been put into motion to the point where they can be enabled when necessary. Now, there was a talk about a special work order in the middle of July, and they actually said, no, that was not to confuse anything, that was actually for Tracy Dyson, should she need to return on a Dragon rather than the Soyuz. But the two contingencies which are now officially on the books are that if they decide to return Butch and Suni on a Crew Dragon, they can either return them on Crew 9 by launching Crew 9 with only 2 astronauts rather than the 4, and then that would mean that Butch and Suni would spend an extra 6 months in space. That would go from an 8-day mission to an 8-month mission. Great for them, I'm sure, if they want to log those flight hours. Or potentially there is another option for returning 3 astronauts on the cargo pallet underneath the couches on Crew 8, should that be necessary. They can also use that temporarily for undocking and other things. So there are options that have been discussed, laid out and analysed and are prepared, but they are not guaranteed to happen. Indeed, there's a lot of internal discussion, and the problem really is there isn't 100% agreement between all the necessary teams that Starliner is sufficiently safe to perform the re-entry. Now, to be clear, if there was like a disaster on the space station like now, they would just jump in the Starliner and fly them home. It's more that the fact that they can't guarantee their safety requirements, which is like 1 in 270, and this may be even more stringent when you consider, by the way, that in the US there is a presidential election 3 months away. Anything that goes wrong with the space station could be potentially very bad for the incumbent, and in particular, Kamala Harris, as the vice president, she is the presidential candidate now, she is actually head of the National Space Council, and while doesn't get involved in these kind of day-to-day decisions, it's very easy for people to like draw this line and imply bad things one way or another. So I can understand why there's a lot of very careful checking going on. Now, other things that's happening is Crew 9 has now had its launch date pushed back a month to the middle of September, and that means that the booster that was going to be used, SpaceX, is now going to use that for a Starlink, and NASA, of course, was saying, oh, well, isn't it great, we're going to get more like flight testing on this booster, isn't it? That's a big change from the days when NASA demanded to have a fresh booster for all their human spaceflight launches, right? And also, Polaris Dawn, they've announced their date is to be August 25th, or no earlier than August 25th, so it shouldn't be too long after that we see them going to space, and of course Jared doing his spacewalk, his EVA in the space flight suit, in the EVA suits. So the next real event on the space station calendar, I think, is one of the Soyuz. There'll be a new Soyuz arriving, I think, in September. I'm not sure if that is going to interact with Starliner. We'll find out depending upon the schedule there. But now we also got to hear a lot more about what is possibly going on here. So As you may know, we talked about helium leaks early on, but the bigger problem was that 5 maneuvering thrusters, RCS thrusters, failed on approach to the space station. Or rather, they underperformed and then were brought offline by the software. Now, these were all aft-facing thrusters, which is an interesting data point, which I'll get to later. Now, the concern is that they've now tested these thrusters and brought all of them. I think there's one that's offline, 4 of them have been brought back online. They're all performing as expected. But danger is that as you're retreating from the station, if something goes wrong, you might be left in a situation where the orbit will recontact the station in a future orbit. And so you want to make sure the spacecraft can get far enough away and on a sufficiently different trajectory that there's no chance of return and no threat to the International Space Station. So the other thing that has come up is the flight software, which according to some people were saying, oh my God, they went and removed all the code. It sounds more like the spacecraft has been configured for humans on board, and therefore if certain contingencies happen, the software falls back to the humans on board, and if there's no humans on board, it takes a while to interrupt that and get the ground control automation all started again. It sounds like it's configuration changes that are involved, but the thing is, they've never tested all these software together because guess what? You've got Boeing being very cost sensitive because that's what Boeing does. And they've said, well, we don't need to test the automated stuff anymore because that's not actually needed for any of these future crew missions, do we? So we don't need to test the entire software stack with this stuff. No, now they're going to have to go and make sure that everything is working. There's no doubt been changes throughout the code stack, and they can't guarantee that things won't go wrong if they enable the necessary automation again. But anyway, coming back to the thrusters. So they have been running a bunch of test firings of these thrusters at White Sands, basically running full duration tests, doing flights to the station and flights back, simulated things. And they have actually started to replicate some of the performance drops that were seen. And it's their case, they believe it is down to Teflon seals inside the oxidizer poppet. So the poppet is a type of valve that is actuated by pressurized gas, and it opens up and it closes. Actually, I believe it's actuated by pressurized gas on Starliner, but I can't be sure in this case. Could well be linked to the helium issues, by the way, the helium leak issues. So anyway, this Teflon seal, they have observed that after heating for a long time, it has been extruding into the pathway and interfering with the oxidizer flow. So that is a pretty good, but not 100% guaranteed cause of this. They can't eliminate everything. And it's interesting, by the way, that the thrusters that failed with this were all aft facing. And if you look at the thruster housing, so they have these things called dog houses on the side of the service module. And they have the orbital maneuvering thrusters, there's 5 of those, and they have, I think, 7 smaller reaction control thrusters for maneuvering, for orienting the spacecraft. And at the back, you have the densest package of thrusters with the orbital maneuvering thrusters and the two RCS thrusters. And so if there was going to be, say, a thermal issue which overheated a seal and caused it to perhaps expand or extrude out of its, seal area, that would be the place you would most likely expect it. So it does start to seem that this is potentially what's going on. Now, if you remember previous flights, they actually had problems with valves. They had the fuel valves on CFT2, they all got stuck in place, or like 13 or whatever. Many of the valves got stuck in place, and they had to take the spacecraft off the pad, tear it all apart and replace all these things. Now, might also remember that Boeing got into a bit of a legal tit for tat with Aerojet Rocketdyne, who were responsible for the thrusters, arguing that it was Aerojet Rocketdyne that were really responsible for this problem. So I won't be surprised if we see Boeing pulling the same thing and arguing that Aerojet Rocketdyne are really responsible for these issues with the seals. On the other hand, I don't know who is ultimately responsible for the design of this thruster housing and the various, plumbing, material compatibility, thermal tests. I don't know who's responsible for that, but you could well see that Boeing will once again quietly try, or loudly perhaps try, to blame somebody else for this particular problem. So anyway, on the other hand, if they do start understanding this, it does mean that they might be able to bring this back safely. And again, I would really like to see Starliner brought back with the crew on board. I think that from what I've heard, it is really, you know, fractions of a percentage risk that we're talking about. We're not talking about certain failure. No, we're talking like, oh, there's maybe a 0.5% failure, a chance of something going wrong, and we're not comfortable with that level of risk on this flight. Maybe 1%, I don't know, but you know, you've got crew, they didn't necessarily, they signed up for a 1 in 270 risk, and it would be entirely, they might decide that they don't want to do that. But they are test pilots, and Sunny of course flew helicopters, which were far more dangerous. So yeah, what else? I think that's the real thing that I see going on. We've got, you know, time is moving forwards. They have to make a decision, and we've really got to the point where it's now affecting space station operations. And Boeing doesn't 100% understand the problem, but they would like to think that they are getting close to understanding the problem. And sure, I would like to think that if they do this, if they bring it back, they will be able to fix this, and then hopefully it will be minor problems going forwards. I mean, you have to remember that when SpaceX flew their first successful demo mission, they brought it back and they performed a test, and they literally exploded the capsule, and they had to go and redesign that. And the next mission they flew was a crewed flight. So even if Starliner returns without crew on board, there's no guarantee that that forces them to perform another demonstration flight. It's entirely possible that they can say, well, you know, we now understand the problem, really we do, maybe we should go to fully operational status. That would be something that Boeing would pursue one way or another, because guess what? There's no more Atlas V boosters available. They would actually have to buy or secure boosters from Amazon maybe if they were going to be able to fly more Starliners, because they haven't got it spec'd out, they haven't got it approved to fly on Vulcan. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's my rough rundown on the status here. I'm going to go off to like Stirling Castle, and presumably there'll be a lot less traffic bothering me there. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.